For centuries, Anne Boleyn has been portrayed as the great seductress of Tudor history, the ambitious maid of honour who bewitched a king, the woman who used her sexuality to destroy a marriage and seize a crown. It's a story repeated endlessly in novels, films and television. Anne the temptress, Henry the helpless victim of her charms. It's no wonder I get so many comments, emails and messages asking me why I spend my time talking and writing about a homewrecker. But when we actually look at the evidence, the primary sources, the love letters and the events of the 1520s and 1530s, that story simply doesn't hold up. Because the surviving evidence tells us something very different. Henry VIII pursued Anne Boleyn, and he pursued her relentlessly. And Anne said no. She rebuffed him. But the more she resisted him, the more determined he became to possess her. So today we're going to look at what we actually know about Henry VIII's pursuit of Anne, the love letters, Anne's reactions, the myth that she seduced him, and whether this famous Tudor romance was really love at all. I'm historian and author Claire Ridgway, and let me tell you more about Henry VIII's pursuit of Anne Boleyn. First, let's consider why Henry VIII even noticed Anne Boleyn and why he became attracted to her. Well, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll know that Anne was very different to the other women at court. She was the daughter of a humanist man who believed that daughters should be educated to the same standards as sons. So her initial education at home had been very different to that of, say, Jane Seymour, her successor as queen. I already went into detail on this in my video, The Making of Anne Boleyn, but suffice to say that she learned more than domestic skills. Then at the age of about 12, she was given the opportunity of a lifetime. She was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in Mechelen. There she mixed with European royalty and she was given a Renaissance finishing. And although she spent only a year there, she then spent 7 years at another Renaissance court, that of France, serving Queen Claude. Can you imagine the impact those two courts had on a girl? How they shaped her, what she learned, the people she met, the women who acted as role models to her, the literature she read, the new religious ideas she was exposed to, the fashion. And can you imagine just how different that made her compared to a gentry girl who'd grown up in England with a standard domestic education? Anne couldn't help but stand out, could she? But there's actually no evidence that the king noticed her in 1522 when she joined the English court. So if Henry VIII didn't notice Anne immediately, when did his interest begin? Unfortunately, this is one of the great uncertainties in Tudor history. We simply don't know the exact moment when Henry first fell for Anne. The evidence is frustratingly vague, and historians have proposed several different dates based on the surviving sources. Historian David Starkey believes that the king's feelings for Anne may have begun as early as the winter of 1524-1525. This theory is linked to a court entertainment known as the Castle of Loyalty. On St Thomas's Day, the 21st of December 1524, the Windsor Herald proclaimed before the court that the king had granted a symbolic Castle of Loyalty to 4 ladies of the court, who in turn appointed a captain and 15 gentlemen to defend it. We don't know who the 4 ladies were in this pageant. Their names simply weren't recorded, but Starkey has suggested that Anne Boleyn may have been one of them. His reasoning comes from the list of men involved in the pageant. Thomas Wyatt appeared as one of the defenders, Henry Percy as one of the attackers, and Henry VIII himself took part in the disguise. During the contest, according to chronicler Edward Hall, the king fought with particular vigour. Starkey describes how Henry proceeded to thrash his opponents and launched such a furious assault on one participant that he nearly cut through a piece of armour protecting the man's neck. Whoa. Was the king trying to impress one of the ladies? Was he demonstrating his superiority over Percy and Wyatt, two men associated with Anne? Possibly, but I think it's a leap too far. Tudor pageants were full of chivalric symbolism and theatrical bravado. It seems more likely that Henry was simply enjoying the spectacle and playing the role of the heroic knight and got a bit carried away. Still, Starkey believes this moment may mark the beginning of the king noticing Anne. It also fits with George Cavendish's account that Henry asked Cardinal Wolsey to break up Anne's relationship with Henry Percy around this time. Other historians, however, favour a later date. Anne Boleyn's biographer Eric Ives places the start of the courtship to Shrovetide 1526, during the traditional jousts held at Greenwich Palace. On Shrove Tuesday, the 7th of February, Henry VIII appeared at the tournament wearing an elaborate costume embroidered with a man's heart in a press surrounded by flames. Alongside this image was the motto, "Declare I dare not." It's wonderfully dramatic, and many historians have interpreted it as a sign that the king had fallen in love, but was not yet able to declare his feelings openly. But again, we need to be cautious. Tudor tournaments were steeped in the language of courtly love. Burning hearts, mysterious ladies, and secret devotion were part of the theatre of these events. So, while the symbolism is intriguing, it doesn't prove that Anne was the object of Henry's affection. It doesn't prove that anyone was. What we can say with far more certainty is that by 1527, Henry VIII was already deeply interested in Anne Boleyn. That year, during a visit from French ambassadors to the English court, a contemporary report records Henry choosing to dance with Anne. The ambassadors were impressed by her knowledge of France and her command of the French language. She clearly stood out. But the most decisive evidence comes later that same year. In August 1527, Henry VIII requested a dispensation from the Pope. This dispensation was for a marriage, and it was to cover the impediment of affinity. In other words, Henry VIII wanted permission to marry a woman whose mother or sister he had slept with. That woman was Anne Boleyn, and of course he'd slept with Mary Boleyn, her sister. By this point, the king's intentions were unmistakable. He wasn't simply flirting with Anne, he was planning to marry her. So Anne must have said yes at this point. And in our book, The Boleyns of Hever Castle, Dr. Owen Emerson and I put forward the idea that Anne decided to accept Henry VIII's proposal after discussing it all with her family over Christmas 1526. Now, of course, we don't have a record of that conversation. No one wrote down what was said in the Boleyn household over Christmas 1526. But if you pause and think about it, Anne's decision to accept the king's proposal would have been one of the most extraordinary choices a Tudor woman could ever make. Henry VIII was offering her the impossible, not the role of mistress, not wealth, not influence, but a crown. And that crown came with enormous risks. Henry VIII was still married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was not going to give up her position quietly. And her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was the most powerful ruler in Europe. Challenging that marriage meant challenging the papacy itself. Anne could not possibly make that decision alone, so it seems highly likely that she discussed it with her family at Hever that Christmas, with her father, Thomas Boleyn, her mother, Elizabeth, and perhaps her brother, George. Lost to history are those conversations at the castle. But at some point during that Christmas, Anne made her decision, and it was one that would change English history forever. And to say yes, Anne sent Henry a love token, and she sent it as a New Year's gift. a jewel set with a diamond and a miniature ship carrying a solitary woman tossed on stormy waters. The symbolism was unmistakable, and Henry himself wrote back thanking her for the gift, but especially, he said, for the meaning behind it, what he called her too humble submission. The imagery was powerful. The ship symbolised protection, like Noah's Ark riding the flood. The diamond symbolised steadfastness, a heart as hard and unwavering as a diamond. Anne was telling the king that she was prepared to face whatever storms lay ahead. She was saying yes. And from that moment on, everything changed. Now that Anne had accepted Henry's proposal, their relationship entered a new phase. But the courtship that led to that moment had been anything but straightforward. Let's look at what led to Anne saying yes to the king. Henry VIII had written Anne at least 17 love letters between around 1526 and 1528. These letters, now preserved in the Vatican archives, give us our most intimate glimpse into their relationship. And what they reveal is striking. Henry VIII was the pursuer. We may not have Anne's letters to the king, but we know from his letters to her, his replies to her, that she left his early letters unanswered. She resisted his advances. At one point, she even withdrew from the court altogether and returned home to Hever Castle. This is not the behaviour of a woman trying to seduce a king. It's the behaviour of a woman trying to avoid becoming his mistress. And that distinction matters enormously because Anne made it clear that she would not follow the path of Henry's previous lovers. She would not become another Bessie Blunt or, closer to home, Mary Boleyn. She would not be the king's mistress, even an official mistress. For Anne, her honour and her future marriage prospects depended on preserving her reputation. Henry therefore had to work much harder to win her. And his own letters show just how determined he was. As historian Eric Ives points out, Anne's refusal should have been the moment when Henry simply gave up and moved on to an easier conquest. But he didn't. Instead, the king became more determined. He wrote more letters. He sent gifts. He apologised when he believed he'd offended her. And Henry VIII was not used to hearing the word no. And yet Anne kept saying it. This dynamic may even be reflected in one of the most famous poems of the Tudor period, Thomas Wyatt's Whoso Lists to Hunt. Many historians believe the poem refers to Anne Boleyn. In the poem, Wyatt describes pursuing a beautiful hind, but noli me tangere, the hind warns, touch me not, for Caesar's I am. Wyatt withdraws from the chase. The imagery here is fascinating because it depicts Anne not as a temptress, but as prey, a creature pursued by the most powerful hunter in the land. One historian, Karen Lindsay, has even argued that Henry's pursuit could be seen through the lens of coercion or harassment. That may be taking things a bit too far, but there's no doubt about one thing. Henry VIII was the aggressor in this relationship. Anne didn't chase him, he chased her. But just as this extraordinary courtship was unfolding, events took a dramatic and terrifying turn. In 1528, England was struck by an epidemic of one of the most feared diseases of the Tudor age, sweating sickness. Unlike the plague, which might linger for days, sweating sickness could kill within hours. Contemporary accounts describe people feeling slightly unwell in the morning and being dead before nightfall. The disease swept through London and the royal court with terrifying speed. Courtiers fled the city. Henry and Catherine of Aragon, who was still his queen, fled London to Waltham Abbey. Meanwhile, one of Anne's maids caught the sweat, and a panicked Anne fled to Hever in a desperate attempt to escape the illness. It was too late. Once at Hever, she was taken ill. For the first time since his pursuit of her began, Henry VIII was forced to confront the possibility that the woman he was obsessed with, the woman who'd just agreed to marry him, might die before he could ever make her his queen. He wrote to her immediately, and what survives is one of the most revealing letters he ever wrote. This wasn't a carefully composed royal document. Historian Sandra Vasoli, who examined the letter in the Vatican archives, described it as a visual mess. Ink blots, smudges, hurried writing. You can almost see the panic in the page, and you can hear it in his words. Here is what Henry wrote. There came to me suddenly in the night the most afflicting news that could have arrived. The first to hear of the sickness of my mistress, whom I esteem more than all the world, and whose health I desire as I do mine own, so that I would gladly bear half your illness to make you well. The second, from the fear that I have of being still longer harassed by my enemy. Absence much longer, who has hitherto given me all possible uneasiness, and as far as I can judge is determined to spite me more, because I pray God to rid me of this troublesome tormentor. The third, because the physician in whom I have most confidence is absent at the very time when he might do me the greatest pleasure. For I should hope by him and his means to obtain one of my chief joys on earth, that is, the care of my mistress. Yet for want of him, I send you my second, and hope that he will soon make you well. I shall then love him more than ever. I beseech you to be guided by his advice in your illness. In so doing, I hope soon to see you again, which will be to me a greater comfort than all the precious jewels in the world. Written by that secretary who is, and forever will be, your loyal and most assured servant. And then it's signed H, AB in brackets, R. So Henry the King and Anne Boleyn, their initials entwined. As promised, the king sent royal physician Dr. William Butts to treat Anne, and she recovered, as did her father and brother, though her brother-in-law, William Carey, was not so lucky. This episode tells us something important about Henry VIII's feelings. By 1528, this was no longer simply a king pursuing an attractive courtier. Anne Boleyn had become central to his plans, his hopes, and perhaps even his emotional life. And his determination to marry her, whatever the cost, only grew stronger. Neither Henry nor Anne could possibly have known what the true cost of this decision would be. At this moment in 1528, their story still looked like a courtship. Complicated, perhaps even dangerous, but still ultimately a private matter between a king and the woman he wanted to marry. Because Henry VIII was already married, and as I said, to Catherine of Aragon, the Holy Roman Emperor's aunt. So ending that marriage would prove far more difficult than the king could ever imagine. What began as Henry's determination to marry Anne Boleyn soon developed into what historians call the King's Great Matter, a bitter political and religious struggle that would drag on for years. It would take nearly 5 more years before Anne finally became queen. In the meantime, Henry would challenge papal authority, break England away from Rome, and begin the process that historians now call the English Reformation. The consequences were enormous. Powerful men who'd once been close to the king, men like Cardinal Wolsey, would fall from favour, and others like Bishop Fisher, Sir Thomas More, and the Carthusian monks would lose their lives. England's religious landscape would be transformed, and a king's pursuit of one woman would ultimately reshape the course of English history. But perhaps the most tragic irony of all is this. Anne Boleyn herself would not live long enough to enjoy the victory that Henry had fought so hard to achieve, because the story that began with a king's relentless pursuit, a king professing undying love, would end only a few years later on a scaffold at the Tower of London. Thank you so much for joining me. Please do subscribe to my channel and help me get to 100,000 subscribers this year. I'd so appreciate you clicking subscribe and helping me with that. I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.